We are multidimensional beings, and we have the capability, not just a theoretical capability, but the actual capacity to realize ourselves as multidimensional beings, and then we can modulate our consciousness.
Hello and welcome to Nameless. Evolution Begins Within, a magazine-style podcast bridging science, mysticism, and the human experience. Thank you for joining us. I'm Julie R. Rocco, and joining me is our co-host, Amin Dadi. On this episode, we are asking, what can we call consciousness? To be clear, no one really knows what consciousness is or how it works, and it's been studied for the millennia. But to get us to expand our minds and open our hearts, we offer some ideas of what it could be. I'll explain the criteria necessary for science to recognize sentience or consciousness in different life forms, and share what beings are thought to have consciousness besides humans and other mammals. In If Not Now, When? Conversations with Alice Wyatt, she reflects on living in the wide open spaces of the West and finding the strength within herself to create an internal life that holds space for her own needs and those of others. And now, here's our co-host, Amin Dadi.
Thanks, Julie. In this episode, we are bringing back Dr. Diane Weiner, this time with his wife and collaborator, Diane. Today, they spark a discussion into a third way between just being mired on the earth in time and space and then totally disconnected via the spiritual bypass. It's something they call relational unity. And later, in this episode of Listening In, our Innernaut explores through dreaming the nature of collective consciousness.
Before we begin, we invite you to take what intrigues you and leave the rest. Our faithful guide in life is our felt sense. When we ask ourselves, how does experiencing this information or situation feel? We easily find our answer. If it doesn't feel right, drop it, move on. It's not meant for you. The same goes for content on our episodes. Some concepts will resonate and feel good, sparking something on the inner planes, while other information may be confusing or not ring true. In those cases, simply leave it behind. We are in a world of the great unknown, where the human eye perceives less than 1% of all available light. So we ask you, how much can really be known when we cannot see 99% of what's in front of us? That's why we believe the key to life is asking the question, how does this feel in my heart? So let's start out the show as we do with the science and definitions of the topic at hand, which is consciousness. So the different types of consciousness are dreams, hallucination, hypnosis, meditation, sleep, and states induced by psychoactive drugs. The Cambridge Dictionary defines consciousness as the state of understanding and realizing something. The Oxford Living Dictionary defines consciousness as the state of being aware and of responding to one's surroundings, a person's awareness or perception of something. And Wikipedia says consciousness, at its simplest, is sentience or awareness of an internal and external existence. Despite millennia of analysis, definitions, explanation, and debates by philosophers and scientists, consciousness remains puzzling and controversial, being at once the most familiar and also the most mysterious aspect of our lives. Perhaps the only widely agreed upon notion about the topic is the intuition that it exists. Opinions differ about what exactly needs to be studied and explained as consciousness. Sometimes it's synonymous with the mind, and at other times, it's an aspect of it. In the past, it was one's inner life, the world of introspective, of private, thought, imagination, and willpower. Today, it often includes some kind of experience, cognition, feeling, or perception. It may be awareness, or awareness of awareness, or self-awareness, either consciously changing you or not. There might be different levels or orders of consciousness, or different kinds of consciousness, or just one kind with different features. Other questions include whether only humans are conscious, all animals, even the whole universe. The different range of research, notions, and speculations raises doubt about whether the right questions are being asked. And I think much of life often comes down to asking the right questions. So in the world of psychology is Titchener's theory, which began with the question of, what is each element of the mind? The conclusion, there were 3 types of mental elements constituting consciousness experience. 1. Sensations, elements of perceptions. 2. Images, elements of ideas. And 3. Affections, elements of emotions. So that's a pretty good place to start, but is that really all that, makes up consciousness? So now let's move on to a scientific filter, which I thought would be easier to actually get a definition of maybe some laid out things of what consciousness is. And I did, but I really had to dig through it to find it because quite honestly, science doesn't really know how to categorize it. So I did find this interesting thing from the Institute of Medical Psychology and Behavioral Neurobiology in Germany. And it says human consciousness emerges on the interface between 3 components of animal behaviors: communication, play, and use of tools. These 3 components interact on a basis of anticipatory behavior control, which is common for all complex forms of life. I found this article on animal-ethics.org called Criteria for Recognizing Sentience, aka Consciousness. So there are 3 general criterias for deciding whether a being is sentient or not. So they involve behavior, experiencing suffering or joy, evolutionary considerations, and physiological, the presence of a centralized nervous system. So the article breaks it down into those 3 categories, and the first one is behavior. And what's most relevant to establish is that a sentient being is not how they react in a specific case, but how the animal or being behaves in general. The behavior of an animal can lead us to the understanding that it is sentient, even if it does not exhibit signs of suffering or joy. Let me just add this. We might not recognize the signs of suffering or joy, and it's because we don't have our heart chakra opened. Because if you have your heart opened, you can feel the suffering or joy of other animals. So here it goes on to say, here's the reason why we believe that they're sentient. They keep themselves alive, and by acting in certain ways and avoiding threats, they continue this behavior, which gives them a wide range of possibilities for survival and for passing on genetic material. So there's a huge number of animals whose behavior by no means is simple. These animals encounter diverse situations where, in order to survive, they must respond appropriately. The brain plasticity that is required is difficult to explain without appealing to consciousness. So look in your cat's eyes, look in your dog's eyes, look in a chicken's eyes. You will see a sentient being if your heart chakra is open. So they also go on to explain evolutionary considerations. So species that are very closely related but diverged in a recently evolutionary tree, that gives reasons for people to believe that there is sentience in these 2 species. So one of the other things that they bring up, which is really fascinating, is how wasteful it would be to have consciousness if it wasn't necessary. So in the case of humans, up to 20% of the energy we consume is spent on maintaining our brain activity. If consciousness weren't necessary to carry out behavior required for survival, it would be a drag, as it would be needlessly consuming energy that could be used for other functions. So what they also point out is that this would be the case for creatures who are unable to move, such as plants or fungi. So they don't really think that they have consciousness. However, they believe that a centralized nervous system is required to have consciousness. So here, I'll just quote this from the article. It is the physical structure and associated functions that make it possible for creatures to have conscious experience. However, as of today, we do not know the mechanism by which this occurs. So it's really interesting that they know that there's consciousness, but yet we still don't really know how it occurs, probably because science has disregarded the human soul. Because if they haven't disregarded the human soul, they would understand that's where consciousness lies, is actually in the human heart, and probably all other sentient beings as well. So what they talk about is the organized nervous system of octopods and vertebrates is very different, but they still believe the complexity behavior exhibited by these octopods leads to the conclusion that they are conscious. So I also found another article on that website called What Beings Are Conscious? So it actually goes, we've kind of covered this a little bit, so cats, dogs, chickens, humans, any kind of mammal, anything with a centralized nervous system, and I don't think I really need to explain all of those beings to you. So now that I've given you the criteria for what they believe concludes to be consciousness, they also say it's reasonable to conclude that vertebrates and a large number of invertebrates are conscious. And I'll just quote the article here. We do not know with full certainty if there are currently animals with minimally centralized nervous systems that don't give rise to consciousness. It may be that all centralized nervous systems that exist currently are centralized enough to host consciousness. So that's pretty interesting. And they go on to talk about cephalopods, which are octopuses and squids. And we've all seen the stories about octopuses who escape from their cages and do all kinds of crazy things because they're really smart. We have to stop thinking that we're the only smart sentient beings on this planet, because we're not.
Our guests this episode are Don Weiner, this time joined in conversation with Diane Weiner, who together have been developing the Gabrielite work, broadband spirituality for the 21st century. Their biographies and more information about their work is available on thenamelessshow.com, our website. Hello, Don and Diane.
Yep. Thank you for joining us this morning.
Our pleasure.
So now
this last interview was fascinating, by the way. I want to hear more stories about science, weird, subtle energy. It was like, I'm like, chickens? I love it. Chickens?
Oh, we got lots of stories.
All right, so let's just for a moment do the invocation, and then we'll at least be sending that vibration out as we go. So, Don, you want to lead us in that?
Sure. Toward the one, the perfection of love, harmony, and beauty, the only being, united with all the illuminated souls who form the embodiment of the messenger, the spirit of guidance.
Well, I guess we can start. I just personally take a few moments. This was changed from master to messenger. What's up with that? I mean, I get it, but what is your take?
Well, I think the obvious meaning is master has come to have some pretty negative connotations, but one reason I'm very happy about this change, where it says the embodiment of the messenger, I mean, generally when people hear the word messenger, they think of all the great beings that have been Christ, Buddha, Muhammad, and so on. But I think now there's a dawning realization, and perhaps that'll be part of what we end up talking about in this interview, that we're all part of this cosmic neural network. We are all part of the embodiment of what is the divine awakening and manifestation, and that collective embodiment of awakening consciousness is the messenger.
So the messenger, in other words, is a more inclusive term than master, which seems to be a kind of thing you get after 50 years of study or something.
Maybe.
Yeah.
Lucky.
And also, it's not a done deal. It's not, okay, this person's cook, they're a messenger, that one's messenger. The messenger is always becoming.
Yes, as an icon famously said in my world, the stars are the same, that they, as it were, when the prophets, the classical historical prophets came. Well, so what's stopping them from being more now? I mean, there's no it's not the end of prophecy. I mean, just because somebody says so. I took some notes on our last conversation, and one of the things that I would like to get into is what is, well, I guess any way you want to answer it, what's a quantum leap? And a friend of mine says, what does he call it? He calls it skip a step.
That's good.
You know, what do you guys? What is that in relation to what we're talking about?
Sometimes we think of things as very continuous. In our lives, we feel that, well, this happened, and then there's no gaps between what we perceive. And that's a mental thing on our part, that we blend all these things together, and it's because we have a linear perception of things. And when something changes all of a sudden, then we almost always try to make it part of that. But when it's too different than what had been going on, then we perceive that there's a break in it.
In physics, when an electron gets excited, it has more energy, it goes to a higher orbital, but it doesn't go like we're going down the road from here to there. It's either in this orbital or it's in that orbital. There's not an in-between. So quantum leap means there's a discontinuity, which is a way of thinking about the Sufi term fana, which the old term is annihilation or shattering, but it's a total shift from a previous state of being in the process of emerging into a higher state of self-organization. And it's not, like Diane was saying, just gently, linearly going from A to B. It's here, and then it emerges into a different state.
So what we're really saying is we're caught in a Newtonian language trying to describe our lives in a linear fashion, which we tend to try to push everything back into because it's comfortable or something.
Which is what has happened for hundreds of years and still is happening about the way that most people think of God as something separate from us in a Newtonian universe. And I think that's the source of a majority of the problems that exist in the world, that perspective that's not valid.
Yeah, I think that on shipboard that Nayad Khan addressed a person who said he saw him going to different services and so on, and says, "I don't believe in God." And Nayad Khan's reaction to that was so clear and to the point. He said, "Well, I don't believe in the God that you don't believe in either."
I love that quote.
Because what are you talking about? This 3-letter word in English? What is that?
Well, it's almost if certainly belief is very important, but as long as you are thinking about believing in something, the built-in implication is that something is separate from you. And there's oftentimes an insurmountable gap between the two, or you think, well, the aim is, as is usually the case in either Hinduism or Buddhism, a total dissolution of any sense of individuality and either merging into the infinite ocean of bliss, or in Buddhism, just freeing from any state of being or becoming.
Well, that brings us to, I guess, the how, which is, how an individual like listening to this program would go, well, okay, I get it conceptually, I get it, I get what you're saying, I can bridge that metaphor, but then I turn on my car in the morning and the battery's dead. It doesn't start. And so now I'm on the earth in a physical body and having a physical problem. And that's tended to be, so what do? You project out that you messed up somehow, or you project out that, oh, darn, I'll be late for work, or whatever. So how is there a sense of how we can reignite that spark, if we want to say that is something like that, in our daily lives. How does that? Is there a thing that you've found over the years?
Yes, I would say begin with your desire. Begin with the things that you see in your world that have turned you on. Your new grandchild, walking in nature, your artwork. I heard you have a studio, and I'm interested in what your studio is there, Julie.
I produce digital media. I produce digital media.
Ah, excellent.
I work on a computer. I used to be a photographer in a previous life and been published, but I don't really do that anymore.
And that even kind of brings something in there that you've been reinventing yourself because of your desire.
Constantly.
Right? So that's already happening. So that we can begin with something that seems to be opening us out into something else. We were speaking earlier about fana and baka. The annihilation is the old word, or shattering of the old form. And that's one wonderful thing of looking at a grandchild, is that we shatter something in us, a set way of being, because now we see this new baby and we see something new. And we are new then in that situation. And what's happening there then is a change from one side to the other, we might say, of when we're thinking of ourselves as separate. But now there's not so much separation anymore. Now there's a dynamism that's happening between these, quote, two sides. And we're pulled into a whole different relationship.
Yeah, so a couple thoughts about your example. If your car breaks down, you're going to be late to work. Oh, damn, it's Monday on Thursday or whatever. That our general way of going through our day is in reaction to circumstances, physical reactions, mental reactions, emotional reactions, and a desire or a wish that we could be someplace else, or things would not be the way that they are right now. So we're not present to really what's happening. So something that I really believe very deeply is that every circumstance without exception is a portal, potentially a portal, an opening to the sacred. And that doesn't mean you sprinkle your fairy dust and magically everything's going to be happily ever after. The external circumstance might not change one bit, but the way that you're in relationship with what's going on can change. So instead of the circumstance being something that gets you further deeply mired in the muck of your complaints and reactions to the circumstance, you're opened up into a whole different way of experiencing the world. So we have a term that we have used that is an alternative to what is usually thought of as the only choices on the menu in spirituality. And what are those? One is duality, and that's the general one. I'm separate from my goal. I'm separate from God. I'm separate from the divine. And the other one is unity. I want to merge. I don't want to be a separated being. Not me, nothing but me should be there. It should just all be, and you can fill in the blank with the divine or whatever. But there's a third choice, and what we call this is relational unity. And this is a way of being in the world, whether it's in external circumstances or whether it's in inner experiences in meditation, in which you very much maintain your sense of identity, but it's no longer this rigid thing where you feel like I'm just what's sitting in my body, I'm just my thoughts and my personality structure and so on. You're in a very permeable, circulating way of relating to whatever it is that you're experiencing. And the Sufis have this wonderful saying. They say that, well, there's two. One, there's a light upon a light. But the other is whenever there's two presences that come together, a third presence is born that's something more than the sum of those two presences. So what transforms the ordinary circumstance into the sacred is exactly that, being in relational unity with the situation and now allowing that third presence to arise that can bring about a transformation literally in the way that your world is, not just in a thought of, well, this isn't so bad, it's going to turn out okay.
I think when I was listening about the grandchild, which I happen to have one that's quite remarkable, and that leads us to desire and heart and feeling, a whole different thing from mental concept into the heart. I'm related to this being hereditarily. They have part of my DNA or whatever in them, possibly, if it's in your bloodline. The leap for me is, so now you're in the checkout stand and the person in front of you is having a difficulty of counting the money and whatever, and you're a little impatient. But that being, when seen as part of you, in a relational way, like, so that's me. So why am I getting so flustered about me? Why can't I just identify with everything as me in that sense? And not have the separation. In a way, I mean, these are vague terms to most people, expanding the heart. Well, the heart is huge. But let's say we're not constricting it anymore. We're not doing anything. But it seems to me that we're feeling that person is in our heart somehow. Is that
right?
Along the same lines you were speaking of, Diane?
Yes, and we are in each other's hearts anyway. We are so connected. We are part of each other. What has to change is our perspective. Mm. So our perspective has been formed through repetition of the same things over and over again that seem to reinforce the way we see things. And then why? Well, because of, and we'll mention something from our own viewpoint, and we become so entrenched in that one viewpoint that we really can't see beyond that.
Yes, and
let me just wouldn't that be like a neurological thing, that they're in a neurological loop? Dr. Joe Dispenza talk about neuropaths and neurological ways of being stuck in the operating system. So I see those people stuck in the operating system of their neurology, not being able to get out of it. It's like in a constant reboot, like on a computer when it's not working properly. Right. And you keep rebooting it. Well, it can't get into the dynamic link libraries because that system's broken. So it can't even get in to read things. So I think the human brain is that way. We get into this oscillation where we can't allow new information in.
Well, that's a good point, and that triggers a thought of, everybody's wondering, well, what is consciousness? How we're going to go about studying what consciousness is. And for decades, scientists have been trying to determine how consciousness arises from the structure of the material object of the brain, and looking at from every which way, even theories about quantum function of the brain. But the problem is that consciousness is not a phenomena that is limited to or particular to the brain. The brain is just the mechanism through which consciousness operates. And so there's never going to be a solution to discovering what consciousness is about as long as the study of it is confined to the organ through which we're able to experience our interactions with each other. And if you want any evidence from this, look at all the documentation about near-death experiences and research that shows that people can be in a delta brainwave state, which is usually associated with deep sleep, and totally aware of everything that's going on. People can be under general anesthesia and later report everything that happened in the operating room. So there's such misconceptions about what it is we're trying to study. And back to the idea of operating system, what we think of happens in the spiritual journey, and this is back to the linear separated perspective, is that we are going to undergo a process of transformation, perhaps through joining a school, perhaps through doing lots of practices, perhaps by getting zapped by a guru, and something's going to happen to us that turns us into something else.
And even I want to say, sometimes from being sick or having some catastrophe happening to us, those are also kinds of phenomena of change.
But in actuality, I think what happens in the process of awakening is that there's a change in, and Julie, you refer to this, what we call our operating system. It's our frame of reference in existence, which isn't just limited to physical existence. It's our frame of reference in inner experiences. And what's changing about that is not that something's happening to this fixed thing that we think of as ourselves. There's an upgrading, you could say, of our capacity of relationship to experience whatever it is we're in relationship with. And this also applies to what we think of as the divine being, instead of thinking of the divine as this fixed, unchanging, eternal thing up there in the sky, that since we know now that everything is interconnected with everything else in existence, what's happening in the process of awakening, it's not just we think of I am awakening, everything is awakening, including what we think of as the transcendent or the divine being. And what's happening? There's an evolution of the capacity of relationship of everything with itself.
Well,
that's what's happening in spirituality.
It brings me to the facts, like, so I guess the question is, I meditate, thinking of that as kind of a receptive state. However, what you brought up in our last episode was that the latif, the subtle energies, actually frame the grosser energies, if to speak of it that way. In other words, the material world, and we talked about the little robot and the chickens and the two-way street about what we are doing. And so we think of ourselves as human in a very life and death 80-year cycle. But what you're alluding to is that in fact, each of us has the capacity, is the capacity to alter the outcome, and certainly this time in the planetary life, perhaps very much needed. That'll shape what we would consider the future. So it's like Pir Vilayat in Icon said, the pull of the future is stronger than the push of the past. And we know that our egos are really made up of the past. I mean, we've constructed our basic, way we navigate through various stuff. So how do we contact or how do we get to subtle energy? How does that work?
Well, let me describe briefly a study, a research that's done by William Tiller, who's a professor emeritus from Stanford, who has been researching subtle energy for decades. And his most famous experiment is he took a little bit of circuitry that's not connected to anything, not powered, shouldn't be able to do anything, put it in the middle of a table, had 4 experienced meditators sit around the table, and their task was to try to put an intention into the circuitry so that when it was shipped to a laboratory that was totally automated, it would raise the pH of water by 1 point without any contact with the water. This has been replicated many, many times, and sure enough, this is exactly what happens over a period of time. Well, by the ordinary laws, in quotes, of physics, this should be impossible. There's no known energy that could do this. How can you store intention into circuitry? But even more remarkable, the way that heat was distributed in those laboratories ran contrary to the second law of thermodynamics, which says disorder is always increasing. Well, actually, order increased in the laboratory. The consciousness had an effect on that. And so what Tiller has shown by many experiments is that whenever there's a connection brought about between subtle energy and what he calls ordinary reality, that there's something added to the usual equations of physics, and now there's new things possible that couldn't have taken place otherwise. Well, this is kind of a long segue to answer your question. Whenever we have an experience, and it could be in meditation, that we get beyond our usual way of experiencing ourselves in reality. It could be with our eyes open in nature, listening to music, being in love, seeing a grandchild, where we feel in this transformed state of being. We have established this link of the subtle and the manifest, and now we've opened up a space of new possibilities. the world has literally changed because of our experience. Not just we're in a happy place in our mind, we have transformed the reality that we live in.
Mm-hmm. Well, there you go.
Well, I want to, so this episode is actually in consciousness and what is consciousness, and trying to figure out, I mean, there's a new article that came out from MIT questioning what really is consciousness. So in your purview, and I would like to hear both of your explanations of consciousness and what, your disciplines say that consciousness is. And then we can deconstruct that, because it's probably a Newtonian idea. But, Diane, I would love to hear, because of your medical background, I'd like to hear what you would perceive as consciousness.
Oh, I have no medical background. I'm a teacher, counselor.
Counselor, that's it.
So we are conscious of something. We think, I'm thinking about these things, that's in my mind. I'm conscious of this. I'm aware, basically, is what we're saying. But that consciousness usually is coming from our ego, from our particular point of view, and we're putting these blocks together to say this is what I am conscious of, and this is who I am as a conscious being. But there's really a part of us that is way more, is malleable. And that perception can expand in amazing ways. One way is to experience these subtle realms that you're alluding to, the subtle, as we speak about the realm of the imaginal or dream world, the realm of the angels or light, the realm of the mystery or the wazifas or the qualities of God, as we participate with those, and then deeper realms up to the divine. And people who are experienced in spiritual practices, often the goal is to get to the higher ones, that we can be conscious of these higher ones. So we put our consciousness into these higher realms. And that's a big relief to be able to experience things like that. But again, this is parceled out into specific places in the in all the possible states of consciousness. They're separate, and so you're popping up to some other place, which might do some good to the one who's an ego, and might cause a separation there even. But one of the goals that we have is to expand that consciousness so that we can experience more than one state of consciousness at the same time, and have fluidity between and among all of these different states of consciousness. Why don't you talk about Bekenstein or one thing?
Well, I will, but first I want to say that, it's in string theory and physics, the most current theory is that there are 10 dimensions of reality, and the ones that we're not familiar with, the size of 3 of space and 1 of time, are curled up inside the other ones, and that's why we don't perceive them. And the mystics of across traditions talk about multiple levels of reality. They call them planes, spheres, subtle realms. They have different names for them, and just like we have different names for colors in the spectrum, they have different names, and I think of them as different vibrational states.
Totally.
Well, Hazrat Inayat Khan, who brought Sufism to the West in the early 1900s, said that the human is the only being in all of creation who has his or her existence in all the realms of being. Well, that's true, but usually our awareness of those other realms is embryonic, it's latent, it's dormant, it's occasionally we might have an experience. Some people it's through drugs, some people it's through meditation, and has, like Diane was talking about, perhaps a peak experience of some other realm. And then usually the person seeks to try to get back to that because it's so blissful and wonderful. And then they can be subject to what Pure Wyatt called the spiritual bypass, going, well, this reality is crappy. I want to go to the land of love and light and go up over here, and not realize that the purpose, as the Sufis say, is awakening in life, that we are multidimensional beings, And we have the capability, not just a theoretical capability, but the actual capacity to realize ourselves as multidimensional beings, and then we can modulate our consciousness. What does that mean? Well, it means just like you have let's say a radio receiver and you can turn to different stations, and you mentioned the Lataif, the subtle vibrational centers in the body, we can attune our vibration to these different states, and we can open up to experience through that modality of vibration. And we can get to the pure light. So the first step is toggling. You're here, you're there, you're back and forth like a ping pong ball. But then you can become capable of what I call multimodal consciousness. You can discover your capacity to experience yourself as existing in all of these states of consciousness. You can't bring them all up at once. It's too big. But you can experience a unitive sense of self, and you can experience the effect of the circulation of light throughout all of those realms. And that, to me, is what spiritual awakening is, developing that capacity that enables us to participate in what the Sufis say is the new creation that's born at every moment. We can bring the fullness of our being into that. And Diane was just asking me to talk about something called Bekenstein's bound. Bekenstein, I think, is a mathematician or physicist who had a very simple conceptual proof. You don't have to be a scientist to understand it at all, but he showed that whenever there's an interface between any two things, and anybody listening to this podcast is using an interface, you might be using your computer, your iPhone, or your Android, or some other device, so you can hear what's been previously recorded. Well, he showed that whenever there's an interface between two things, there's a finite limit to how much information can go through in either direction, and it's directly related to the size of the screen. So what I was inspired to get from this idea is, imagine you go into a laboratory and there's this computer sitting there, and you enter the right password, and it says, welcome, this is God. God's on the other side of the interface. But God is subjected to the same finite limit. There's a finite limit to what God can know about you through the screen, and vice versa, which says to me it's impossible. It's an outdated idea that there can be an omniscient God that knows everything that there is, because everything that there is becoming something as yet previously unknown, and it's the connection between the two sides, between the manifest and the transcendent. Sometimes I just think of it as with the rest of myself, or even Arby says we all have a personal Lord or a personal angel. However you think about that connection with a deeper level of being, that only through that connection can something be created that furthers the purpose of existence.
When you talk about the here and now and every moment, aren't we really, one of the ways of describing that is through the breath, because 12 to 18,000 times a day, we're doing an in-breath and an out-breath. And but between those two, at the bottom and the top of the breath, are a still point, in which we are not manifesting, nor are we going back into non-manifestation, but we are actually at a moment of, I don't know, I kind of look at it as Christian or Kamal. It's a point where there is, in fact, a possibility of a spark from the everything into our being. I don't know. Do you have any sense of that yourself?
Yes, and I think of it in terms, Peter Wyatt's terms of the moment of time and the instant of time. And what you're talking about is that instant of time that's between everything.
Right.
And what he's talking about is the place between everything also. That in that gap, there's all the potential. Because that gap is between all of our constructs, all of our concepts.
Right.
And when we get to that place which is beyond that, or to always be in touch with that place is what we're talking about, then that can keep expanding. And as it expands, your connection with everything expands. So that now you whatever happens with you, you are experiencing it happen in everything. So that there's communication now starts to happen between everything that there is.
Yes, and the typical or the old way of thinking about this is, well, now you brought something through from the divine, bring it into creation, and you're enlivening it, you're adding something to it. You're a channel for the divine. And even Arbi, my favorite thing, he was a Sufi that lived in the 1200s, I think. My favorite thing that he ever said was that every soul has access to a unique part of the divine wisdom that no other soul ever has or could have access to. Well, again, the usual way of thinking about this is there's like this Akashic record sitting up there somewhere, and now you've got the passcode and you can read what's written there like it's just sitting there, but it's not just sitting there, it's being written as we go, and we're participating in that. And furthermore, it's not you just bringing something through from the divine, it's you as a further reach of the divine in existence, connecting back with the source of your being. And it's through the meeting of those two sides in this in-between state that Diane is talking about that something emerges that could not happen by either side by itself. It could not happen from what we think of as the divine side, and we just have to get with the program and bring it through. So one thing that we say in the work that we do is that everything is Gabriel. Everything is seeking to announce its unique divinity.
That kind of, to me, speaks to what we might call poor self-esteem. So if you think of yourself as just you and the universe is capable of pouring things into you, you kind of devaluing an extra ego outside of the ego part of you. In other words, your ego is going to say, poor me, I'm the worst, or I'm the best, or a concentric circle that keeps getting smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. And what we're talking about, it seems to me, is that you may have seen this in counseling, that moment when they let go of that, whatever that, cry through it, get rid of it, somehow expunge it, just go beyond it, and then they're open into a new space, which is the Phanabaka being utilized that way. So I think personally that our difficulties as humans has been thousands of years of this one-way street idea of who we are.
This relates to the way that I think about the whole notion of karma, that the accumulated results, whether you believe in past lives or not, of what you've done, you've got to pay for it or be rewarded for it. It's going to come through, and it has to play out before your business is done. Well, that's if you're identified with all that has been, and it's a fixed notion of yourself up to that point in time, as opposed to realizing that that was just a fixed concept that you have turned into, like in the Matrix movies, a simulation of what you thought you were. And at any instant, the ancient Sufi said, oh man, if you but knew that you're free, it's your thought of captivity that keeps you in change. At any instant, you can be free from that. And that's such a simple thing to say, but Innernaut said that...
Hold on a minute.
Innernaut Khan said that in India are you ready?
Just wait a second.
I'm on airplane mode. So, I know, Wi-Fi. That's it. You don't turn off the Wi-Fi, it comes to get you from some other place. All right. Okay. Sorry.
Okay, so Innernaut Khan said that the reason that there's temples in India that you have to circumambulate 100 times and see all these rituals before you can go in is that human beings love complexity, and the truth is simple, and people couldn't just deal with the thought you can just go in there and be present to this awe and wonder, so you have to go through all of this stuff. So one humorous way I sometimes think about karma is that someone is standing on their own foot and don't realize it, and they're saying, ow, and this little kid comes by and says, hey, mister, why are you standing on your own foot? And the person thinks it's their karma that they're experiencing pain.
Right.
One comment from Peter Wyatt also that relates, I think it was him saying it. You don't have to schlep this.
Yeah.
You don't have to schlep this self, I guess, into the future.
Right. They're using the Yiddish
Or
term.
the karma. You don't have to schlep all of this karma with you.
Stop schlepping.
Right.
Wake up from schlep.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it's important, which is why we're doing this podcast, is to expand at least people's idea of who they are, beyond our concepts of who we are, which is mind-blowing in itself. And then we come to the notion of the heart. And Innernaut, has said, and other Sufis, that the mind, is the surface of the ocean, and choppy water and all of that. You're just being tossed around. But in the depth, which is the mind hyphen heart, the mind heart, it's silent. It's quiet. It's not disturbed. And of course, my initiator, Kahira Kalbi, was famous in saying, drowning? Dive deeper. So it's a kind of a koan of, you think you're drowning because of all this stuff up here. Well, just dive deeper, which of course is irony. Why we're interested in your work is you seem to have put together in a very dense way, a 300-page book, including 30 meditations and more, and a real connection in which you call the human asterisk divine. So if I get the gist of what we've been talking about the last little bit, is to really redefine, for at least as a doorway, because we're still talking about concepts, if we're talking about defining something, that we have been neglecting through our lack of awareness, the divine aspect of ourselves.
Well, I would say we've been neglecting the relationship between the human and divine aspects of ourselves. And you referred earlier to low self-esteem. We've been dissing the human side, like it's it's either illusory or it's off the path, and it needs to get back on it. It needs to be changed into something else, instead of realizing that it's the crown of creation. It is the very place of emergence of the divine being awakening to him herself through each of us in existence, and not just to a static self, but awakening to an evolving self that requires the participation of everything in manifestation with everything in what we think of as a transcendent. So it's getting beyond a dualistic sense of self. It's ennobling the purpose of our existence, and it's also, Diane was talking about desire earlier. Hazrat Khan said every desire begins with a divine impulse. It gets distorted, and for years I thought, well, the point was just to get rid of the distortions and bring it through and follow the instructions, but I realized now that's not the case. That was just a starting point. That was like if someone is creating a work of art or a piece of music, they start with a seed thought, but hopefully it gets transformed through the experience along the way into something more than what they could have ever come up with. And it takes that connection between the two sides for that to happen.
An important idea that I hold in my heart is that of that we can become our own compassionate witness. That to me, that's the first step when things get grungy and grouchy, to find that part within ourselves that is compassionate with what we see ourselves as at that moment. So that it gets that compassion flowing. And at that point, then the other part of you feels cared for and loved and okay. And then that opens up to more openings that now you start to see around you, that kind of compassion for everything, or somebody else that you want to feel compassion for. And everything begins to flow. To me, I mean, as you were talking about that, what I call the instant of time, that's getting into that place now, rather than in the construct from which everything can flow. But it begins with that compassion from that part of yourself that is the witness. As often we have the critical witness going most of the time, and that's not the helpful one. So
Right.
that for me.
Ego hammering and shattering.
So you guys are married. How long have you been married?
We just celebrated 50 years.
Wow. Congratulations.
Wow.
So going for the next 50.
So good. Yeah, that's what I say. I'm middle aged. I'll be 146 when I pass away. And why not? Why limit myself? More exercise anyway. So so in that, and you stated that, and I think it's a good thing. So we come to interaction on a very intimate level, living with someone else. Or as the two Sufis used in the 12th century, I forget which ones they were. One said to the other, they'd gone to graduate school in the law, in Quranic law and whatever, and they were best buddies. And one said to the other, "Oh, I am so happy I met you while we were still in duality."
Well, we're not going beyond duality.
Pardon?
I say we're not going to go beyond duality. That would be a pretty weird marriage where there's...
Well, we're going to relational unity.
Relational unity.
Relational unity. So how does that work in marriage?
Well, okay. So I don't think anybody ever gets to a point of the old concept of enlightenment and everything is just perfect.
Oh, static enlightenment.
Yeah, everything is just wonderful all the time. And personally, I wouldn't sign up for it if there were such a possibility, because I'd be bored to tears. But of course, we get caught up in things. But hopefully over time, we get better and better at recognizing when that's happened. And we can use that as a reminder, oh, I forgot. I am. And I mean, for me, it's become just easier and easier, as soon as I recognize that, to just open up into that place where I feel a very vast sense of self. And Pure Light would talk about the elephants in India with the chickens pecking at their feet, and they were far too noble to let themselves be bothered. So it's like that shift of a frame of reference going, wait a minute, what are we doing here with this? And then looking at the big picture of things. So let me do another little segue here. Osman Khan said that there is but one sacred scripture, and the leaves on the trees are the pages of that scripture. So I've gone with that and added the thought that each of us is creating what the Sufis call the allegory of our souls. It's like the story of our being, not just in this life, before, beyond, after, manifest, transcendent, and so on. But every experience in our life is part of that allegory of our soul. And when we are in a state of relationship with what we're experiencing, either externally or internally, we're adding another page to that sacred scripture that becomes available to everything else in existence. So what that means is we can take those very circumstances that we think, oh my God, like the pandemic has been horrible. There's no two ways about that, all the suffering it's created and everything. But in the midst of that pandemic, Diane and I taught, 30 some odd Zoom classes, created the book that we've created, Awakening as a Human Divine Being, are in the process of making another book out of classes we've given since that. And many people that have been involved with us have experienced tremendous transformation by what's come through our whole group. I mean, it's the awakening that's taking place with a group of fellow seekers. So something very beautiful has emerged in the midst of something very horrible. And it doesn't take away how horrible it is and the fact that, we need to do what we can do to make things better in the world. But we can become like the lotuses arising on the scum in the pond water.
Speaking of Hazrat Inayat Khan, something about the breakthrough comes when your elbows have no more room to move. In other words, the constriction has caused you to burst out you can't be in that box anymore.
Yeah.
And boy, are we in a big box.
Big Newtonian
box.
Big opportunity.
We need more dimensions.
Yeah, bring on the dimensions.
Well, so speaking of the Newtonian thing, I just kind of want to segue into, can you just speak about Newtonian versus quantum and how consciousness is filtered through those two different dimensions? Because the Newtonian world is very rigid and quantum is like, we can do anything to some.
Okay. So Newtonian, which has been the prevailing view since the, 1600s in much of science, and certainly in religion. Religion is not caught up to quantum physics, and hopefully it will in the next 50 years, hopefully sooner. But it's the clockwork universe, which is based on causality. And back to the notion of karma. Karma is a very causality-based notion. You did this has to happen as a result. You are moving through time subject to the good or bad consequences of all that you've done before. And this is the universe. And the universe, the Newtonian physicists thought that if they could know the precise location and speed of every particle in the universe, that everything was predetermined. They could just calculate what was going to happen. Well, it didn't work out. Billiard ball model. And Pierre Wyatt was always talking about a purpose-oriented spirituality, that it wasn't based on causality. And the Buddhists have this wonderful principle called mutual co-arising, which means everything is the cause of everything else. So nothing, you can't really separate, here's this is causing this. From one perspective, it looks like that. From another perspective, it looks like what you thought you caused actually caused what you did that brought about what you think you caused. Time is not linear. Time goes in both directions. And Julie, you're shaking your head, and that's good. I like to tell science stories because people's minds have to become boggled to loosen up enough to be open to a different viewpoint of reality. So what's come from quantum physics?
I love my brain scrambled. It's my favorite thing. That's why I kept taking classes in college that hurt my head. I'm like, I don't know what to do.
So what's come from quantum physics is the realization that everything is interconnected with everything else. Everything is influencing everything else instantaneously outside of time and what we think of as space. And the future can influence the past as well as vice versa. The most current theories are even more fundamental than energy, and even more fundamental than consciousness is information. But it's not information the way we think of it as like data stored in an encyclopedia. It's fascinating. I like to try to read about what people are saying. So Seth Lloyd, who's a computer scientist at MIT, had an article in Scientific American, and he postulated that the entire universe is a giant quantum computer. And he posed the question, well, what is it computing? And he said itself. And this is the quantum physics equivalent to what the Sufis say, the universe was created because God was a hidden treasure desiring to be known. And I think of the purpose of existence as wisdom. And wisdom emerges through our relationship with everything else. And what we think of, some of the listeners to this will be familiar with the alchemical process. stages you go through, like in a retreat. But usually you think of you are going through these stages, and hopefully at the end you're in a different place than at the start. But in actuality, what's happening, if the retreat really worked, is your relationship with what we're calling your human divine relationship has evolved. Now it's become capable of something deeper than what it was capable of before. So quantum physics, through things that they're discovering that are just so mind-boggling, like questions like, well, what happens when things go into a black hole? Is all the information lost? And there's theories, well, it's stored on the event horizon. There's another theory, well, it emerges through a white hole. We don't know. It's kind of hard to arrange to go through a black hole and see what happens to you.
Can we just send the camera down through?
Well, the Sufi version of that story is on the other side of the wall is people would climb the wall and then have this ecstatic look and then disappear on the other side. And so they stopped one person when they're at the top of the wall. It didn't let him go through, but when he came back to the starting side, he was mute. He couldn't say what happened. So as long as we're trying to study consciousness as a phenomena separate from ourselves, we're never, ever, ever going to get there. And I think many scientists are realizing, like William James was so far ahead of his time. He was the psychologist that, really studied consciousness in the early days of psychology, that, there's people in different mystical traditions who've been researching this for thousands of years. Maybe you should pay attention to some of the methodology, and it doesn't mean you have to adopt the belief system. There's a technology of consciousness that's been developed over time that can really help us in our journey of awakening.
From Jack Kerouac's haikus, a black bull and a white bird standing together on the shore.
And here is If Not Now, When? Conversations with Alice Wyatt.
Space to breathe, space to be. I was born and raised on the West Coast, but when I was 18, I headed east for a year-long internship with a traveling theater company. Spending time in the mountains of West Virginia, the rocky seacoast of Maine, and being enveloped by the big city bustle of New York City was life-changing and exhilarating. When it came time to head back to Oregon, though, when my car crossed the Mississippi River and the vastness that is the West spread out before me, I began to take big, exaggerated breaths and feel alive in a way I hadn't in over a year. This is a frequent comment from tourists visiting our small New Mexico town. I can breathe here. There's so much space. If our conversation has time to go deeper, which it often does because the pace of life is pretty slow around here, I find they have discovered more than just vast physical space. They have also found more mental, emotional, and spiritual space, something they didn't even know they needed. We live in a culture where we are bombarded with preconceived ideas of what we should be, based on our gender, race, size, shape, beauty quotient, family background, socioeconomic status, etc. Too many of us are placed into a series of boxes that have nothing to do with who we actually are inside of our heads or hearts. This discovery, this realization of the need to break out of the boxes, to fight for space in our mental, emotional, and spiritual lives, is often a slow journey. For me, it took almost 25 years of struggle, feeling like I was squeezed from all sides, not understanding why or how to get out from under the pressure. Most of my life has been rural, with small-town, traditional Christian values. Life is defined by the people who came before you, and outsiders are always that, outsiders. Life is hardscrabble. You pull yourselves up by your bootstraps, sitting and thinking better be on the back of a horse or a tractor, not in a soft armchair. While not materialistic, the boxes I was pushed into were result-orientated. Art and literature and deep thoughts were nice enough, but they weren't going to put bread on the table, were they? One does not realize this, of course, this pressure to fit into a box. For me, it came in the form of guilt when I threw together peanut butter and jelly sandwiches and sent my kids outside so I could read just one more chapter of my book or finish that letter to a friend. It came from wanting to have an authentic conversation about faith and finding mere platitudes thrown my way. I would look around at my life and think I didn't fit in or I was less than, rather than having a realistic view about my personality and my needs. In moving to New Mexico, I too was in awe of the vast blue sky and the wide open spaces. You can see for miles, only a jackrabbit and some cacti between you and the next mountain range. After settling in, though, I began to meet people who were somehow not hemmed in by our culture. They were somehow free of the boxes of expectation, guilt, busyness, have and have-nots, and what do you do that had defined so much of my life. In my last group of friends, a get-together would involve phones pulled out, schedules rearranged, and maybe a date penciled in for next month. Here, I find myself walking arm in arm down the street, sitting down to coffee 5 minutes later. There is no notice given to financial status. People who call a mansion on the hill home are best friends with someone who lives month to month on a Social Security check. Here, people believe in aliens, have friends from past lives, are every gender under the sun, wear whatever is most comfortable, and are friends with their exes. And when they have some money tucked away, put a clothes sign on their shop and journey off to parts unknown to have an adventure. There are no constricting societal boxes to be seen. When my husband and I split up, that was a box I needed to break out of for a while. We had friends who wrapped us up in their arms, didn't take sides during our journey, and were the first to celebrate when we got back together. Their lack of judgment allowed us to process and heal at our own pace. There was still room for us in our community despite our brokenness, or maybe because of it. That space was held for us by people who had first found that space within themselves. They had found grace, forgiveness, patience, and tolerance, applied it to their own lives, and then given it as a gift to others, to me. Now, this little New Mexico town is not nirvana. Oh, most certainly it is not. There is poverty, pettiness, corruption, ignorance, greed, all the things you find everywhere. Somehow, though, maybe because of the vastness of the physical world that surrounds us, maybe because there are historical roots of healing here, people find the courage to cast off the pieces of themselves that no longer fit, the things that are keeping them from being who they want to be. Some days, I actually expect to find exoskeletons laying out in the desert beyond town, because there are so many new people walking around, people whose faces I recognize, but whose countenances have been transformed through courage, hard work, and enough space to breathe and process without pressure. A yoga instructor friend has a saying, "Wherever you go, there you are." She uses it to remind us that we can't escape our problems. We have to deal with them from the inside out. I am planning a month-long road trip, a trip back to places that hold boxes I used to live in. I will see people who may think I still live in those boxes. There is some trepidation in my heart as I take out my calendar and figure out who I will visit when. Will I fall back into that tiny space where I could only be what people expected me to be? My hope is I will take my metaphorical desert mindset with its vast blue skies and wide open spaces with me. I want to finally be me in a way that creates empowering space for every single person I get to wrap my arms around. If I am successful, they may be tempted to look in the trunk of my car for the old dried-up exoskeleton I finally wiggled out.
Cosmonauts and astronauts explore outer space, but there's an inner world as well. So let's explore beyond light and sound and time and space. Join us as we listen in to an experienced Innernaut. Get introduced to a new language to describe uncharted, inverted space. We enter through the portal of dreams.
Where I stand in relation to what is going on in manifestation. Something has happened in the collective consciousness, in the maze of stuff which has its veils and confusion and is twisted and misaligned, looking crooked and filthy from the perspective of someone who tries to look at things righteously. My partner dreams that she has gone to an area where there are wooden houses, where everything is stuck, and that situation is stifling to her. She has to go into another room or access another part of herself where that isn't the case. And when she comes back from the dream, she tries to shift that woodenness that she's carrying as a vibrational quality or sense inside of herself. She admits to me that she doesn't know if she shifted it. My response to that was, everything is known, but nothing is for certain. The place I went was where everything is controlled by the collective consciousness, and that is haywire. It was a pretty sloppy place to get to, swampy, the route was awkward, but I got to the end of the route. I found something there, and I didn't realize I was taking it with me until I got back and noticed I had actually found something. On the way back, I break away from the others walking with me. I take a quick left turn and take a shortcut while the others take the long way, which doesn't involve having to go through a crowd of people and all kinds of things going on. I get back a couple of minutes ahead of the others, and then I take this object that is a little oily and I place it high above a wall. When the others come back, the first thing they ask me is, why did I leave them? I told them that I thought that they knew I was taking a shortcut and point to the object above the wall. I suspect they're going to notice that something's not quite right now that I've pointed it out. They can see the walls are streaked and dirty. Getting it up there, somehow I streaked it. And so I told them all I need to do is clean the wall, and that will keep everybody happy. So the meaning, this is a dream which is pointing out where I stand with regard to prevailing collective conscience, confusion and misalignment, and my attempts to hide and conceal. So in the dream, I found an answer and did so by taking a route through the crowded scene of things, and brought back what existed at the end of the swampy maze. I know the route through the swamp maze, and I also know the shortcut. And so the result of the scenario is an opinion that is rendered and responded to in terms of how I am currently feeling, because all of a sudden, yesterday, there was such a miscarriage of justice. I could feel inside that there was an answer. Instead of reacting with my mind senses, I could feel it inside. But could I catch up with this? Not only did I do that, but in the end, I create a workable result for everyone, including the public, because the intent of what took place was to take something from the public to veil them. And so the scenario requires a shift from the collective consciousness function that takes things from ordinary individuals and keeps them dumbed down so they don't even know what they do not have. This was accomplished because I don't work for myself and handle this by cleaning the oily, streaky public wall. So that was the sleep dream that corresponded to my partner's. The meditation dream pointed out that I had to be able to do two things at one time, be both in the inner and in the outer. The first step is the giver. That's the inner into the outer, which is part of the out-breath, and that's a part of seeing too. That's the first step. The second step? Here's where things get tenuous, but there's a way there too, because you're not using the same approach that you're doing on an out-breath, which is when your focus and attention has a kind of pure mind quality or a pure light. You don't have that available to you on the second step, because here it is being done with a collective expansiveness going back with the heart. So I got the first step, and then I was looking at how to put the second step together. Some part inside of me must have concluded that I knew how, even though I wasn't there yet, and it was probably dumbing it down even in my dream world, trying and trying this way and that to see how the second step could work. The dream world got tired of that, and so I woke to the phone ringing. The phone wasn't ringing, but it was enough to bring me back. It was just in my head, but I still couldn't open my eyes. They were glued shut. I came to the surface enough to know that that phone isn't really ringing, and I realized enough to know that I'm supposed to wake up and write this up. I have to trust in having caught the feeling and can bring the feeling from the unconscious into conscious. I couldn't open my eyes, so I swirled around groggily in this, probably numbing and dumbing it down, and then all of a sudden, instead of waking up and trusting and knowing that it was just going to come through, because that's how it's always worked, I went back into the dream world and probably numbed myself down by reducing the acuity and veiling it a bit. I have to mess with this. What is going on is before going into meditation, I was feeling the way out. I couldn't figure it out with my mind, but my heart was revelational and expansive. It was feeling great, but the rest of the memo wasn't there. But the first step in terms of what could be done with inner into outer, bringing something through, occurred when I talked to someone, and all of a sudden, they came to a breakthrough that required trusting yourself, in terms of the heart resonation that needs to make itself known. And you have to abide in it, not abiding in your mind senses. That is the type of abiding that you find in the in-breath. In-breath works with sound, works with healing. It's in the spatiality. The level of light that needs to quicken in the world is in the first step. From what unfolds from the first step, the second step responds or reveals itself, making a complete loop so that everything is taken into account. I'm not accustomed to a two-step dream world, this being in an aspect that is still words you're playing with, aspects that are still swirling. You are playing with something that's a given, and then you're playing with something that is still uncertain. You have to start with the seeing, to work with the uncertain. That can be made into a loop, a full circle, wholeness. So the significance of this is the awakening process. Everything starts from the inner into outer, and that's the first step, and involves seeing. As you get fragmented into pieces with the mind senses and do not see a spatiality where everything's spread out, yet it all packs down into something as small as a human being who contains the entire universe inside of themselves. The fragmented pieces are off the ground by being like this which lends itself to spiritual illusion. So, what took place does not involve putting hearing in front of the seeing. It's the other way around, because if you do that, you're trying to climb the Tower of Babel through subjectivity. You can get like that. You can carry yourself in a particular lilt, in a particular malaise, and you'll actually glow, but it's unconscious. So what is it that's unfolding? Well, what is meant to unfold is a shift. And the question is, can I catch up with its acuity? It's there, but can I see it? Can I get it and shift? You know, above and below, which is inclusiveness, which is grace. That's grace. That's accepting everything which leads to the unpredictable because nothing's fully imposed. That's why it's grace. Even though everything is known, that's the storyline of man. This is how he plays, with himself as God.
Next time on Nameless, we speak to Dr. Hassan Gebel, who has a PhD in astrophysics and a master's in counseling psychology. We explore with him what thoughts could be, and talk about how we, the ultimate observers, affect everything we encounter. We hear the latest in field report from our Innernaut on our Listening In segment, and hear another fabulous story in If Not Now, When? Conversations with Alice Wyatt. If you've enjoyed what you heard on this episode, please be sure to tap the subscribe button on your favorite platform. For Nameless, Evolution Begins Within, which comes out every other week. And if you would be so kind as to write us a review on iTunes, we would be very grateful. You can also follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube.
In our prep work for the Nameless show, we have come across some provocative quotes. We have culled 365 of these from our work with quantum mechanics, mysticism, and alchemy to post on our Twitter feed, Daily Dervish. Dervishes are infamous for saying or doing something disruptive to the collective amnesia. Get your daily disruption on twitter.com by subscribing to Daily Dervish.
Transcripts are available in multiple languages, including English, Spanish, and Hindi. If you would like a transcript in your native tongue, please email us at thenamelessshow@gmail.com. For article citation, links for further study, and show references, please go to thenamelessshow.com. None of this would be possible without our dedicated team of lightworkers: Cheryl Ray, Carol B., Yoselin de Riojas, David Clare, and Rain Jubilee. The theme sound for the Nameless Show was created by Rob Carey at Cosmic Turtle Sound Studios, Truth or Consequences, New Mexico. Additional music by Paul Lee, Rory Marola, AJ Pantaleo, and Dan Gallagher. Voiceover acting talent for the Listening In segment by Yasna Brown, Teresa Langston, and John Bellimer. The Nameless Show, copyright 2021 under Sophia Unity Foundation. Wisdom is one.